Hello, I'm James Ezimoha. Welcome to Africa News. Let's see your headlines. Uganda wraps up presidential election amid allegations over election malpractice. Proposed multi-billion-dollar gas pipeline linking Nigeria to Morocco faces funding challenges. And the European Union removes Nigeria and 5 other African countries from high-risk financial transaction grey list. Voting has ended across Uganda following a day marked by delays and a heavy security presence, with President Yoweri Museveni seeking to extend his decades-long rule and opposition leader Bobi Wine challenging the status quo. Attention now turns to a closely watched and potentially decisive count.
The day began with delays after technical problems left many voters stranded at polling stations. But as the day progressed, lines of people stretched outside schools, community centers and town halls across the country, eager to make their voices heard. 8 candidates are vying for the presidency, including Uganda's incumbent President Yoweri Museveni, who has ruled Uganda for nearly 4 decades.
We are now earning more than $13 billion in export earnings. Now our export earnings are now higher than our import bill. We are importing less than we are exporting. But there is about 30% of the people who are still who are still outside the money economy. These are the ones now we need to deal with.
Opposition leader Bobi Wine cast his ballot at his home near the capital, echoing what he has said throughout the campaign.
In many places, including Entebbe, the presiding officers are soldiers. They picked SFC soldiers to take over that voting exercise. So, while we are confident about winning the vote, we have questions about the declaration of the rightful result.
Throughout the day, security remained tight, with police and military patrolling streets across major towns and cities. A nationwide internet shutdown limited updates on the voting process, leaving many Ugandans reliant on traditional media for information. As night fell, counting got underway at polling stations across the country. Election officials say final results could take several days as political tension remains high, and both domestic and international observers closely monitor the process for any signs of unrest or disputes.
A proposed gas pipeline linking Nigeria to Morocco is being billed as a strategic energy corridor from Africa to Europe. But despite financial pledges and long-term promise, the multi-billion-dollar project faces political, security and funding challenges before construction can begin.
With an estimated cost of $25 billion and a capacity of pumping 30 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas annually, the ambitious Nigeria-Morocco gas pipeline has been positioned as an alternative gas route to Europe from the heart of Africa at a time of heightened global energy uncertainty. While a final investment decision on the project is still in the works, some investors like the United Arab Emirates, the OPEC Fund, the European Investment Bank and others have pledged financial commitments.
This initiative is great. Sending it to Morocco, Morocco now understands how to use its affinity and closeness to Europe. From Morocco to Europe, probably 20 minutes. So Morocco is now becoming a very big attraction, big commercial attraction for Europe and MENA.
And because it is also a project that cuts across 13 African countries, it is expected that African funding will also be put on the table. So the Afrexim of this world, the AFC of this world, the ADB of this world, those are all African financing, development financing institutions who will be required to pitch in into a financing like this.
But financing alone may not be enough. At the heart of the project is a question of gas supply and whether Nigeria can consistently deliver volumes at scale.
We don't have sufficient infrastructure to deliver gas to our own domestic economy. So it's frankly, even though it's a good idea, none of this really makes any sense until we get serious about making the necessary investments in infrastructure.
As part of its Decade of Gas initiative to harness much of its 200 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves, Nigeria is ramping up investments in the country's gas sector. The government says it aims to unlock as much as $20 billion in new investments from 70 priority gas projects over the next few years.
Our gas production has also increased from about 6.5 million standard cubic feet to about over 7 billion standard cubic feet per day. So I think some of those are underpinned by very structural changes.
Construction of the pipeline is expected to begin after the final investment decision, with a completion date of 2046. Nigeria is counting on the project to help it monetize its huge gas reserves and reduce current massive flaring. Should the project come to fruition, the country would effectively be on the path to energy security.
The European Union has removed Nigeria from its list of high-risk third country jurisdictions and the Financial Action Task Force's grey list. South Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Mozambique and Tanzania have also been removed from the list of countries whose banking systems are set to enable terrorism financing. Tasema Kande has more.
The EU says the affected countries have taken measures such as addressing technical deficiencies and strengthening the effectiveness of their anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing frameworks. It says the moves have boosted confidence in their financial operations and regulations. President of the Financial Action Task Force, Andrew Madurazo, at a press briefing, said the goal of subjecting financial systems to testing is to make the world's defenses against criminals stronger. Nigeria and South Africa were placed on the list in 2023, while Mozambique and Burkina Faso were placed in 2022 and 2021. The countries such as Nigeria have welcomed the move, describing it as a big win for the country and the African continent, adding that it will boost trade and investor confidence. Authorities say placing them on the list implied that transactions with European partners were subjected to stricter documentation and additional oversight, which was a disincentive to trade and investments and financial flows. Tessem Akeni for A News in Jos.
As the African Cup of Nations 2025 reaches its climax in Morocco, questions are being asked about African football's present and future. To help us understand this journey, we're joined by Solis Chukwu, editor of AfricFoot Nigeria, and Arthur from Lagos. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome, James. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Now, for viewers outside Africa who may only follow the AFCON in passing, how would you explain what this tournament means culturally and emotionally to African fans beyond football itself?
I mean, we know the unfortunate legacy of colonialism and the impact it has had on Africa, both politically and socio-economically. So in many ways, the AFCON is viewed on the continent as a celebration, an avenue for all of Africa's football fans to come together and to share their experiences, share their influences, and really sort of get an understanding and a feel for the pulse of the entire continent. So beyond just the football itself, is very competitive. We get to see a lot of cultural expression at the Africa Cup of Nations, to understand the identity of different nations, different peoples, their expectations, their hopes, their aspirations as well. All of that is brought to bear at the Africa Cup of Nations. And that would explain why it's a really colorful, usually very boisterous occasion. So yeah, AFCON, football is something that's really, really important the world over. But for us here in Africa, it holds a special significance, especially, like I said, for the cultural aspect of it, but also because we in Africa, we do not have very many thriving leagues a lot of our players are based in Europe as well. So AFCON is also in that way a homecoming. So we in Africa, we tend to view it as a chance to welcome back our heroes and our stars who we spend so much time watching on TV, playing the biggest competitions in the world. They come back home and they give back to their people, and we also give to them in terms of the love and the support that they may not have been exposed to from being away for so long.
Now, critics often point to logistics, scheduling, and or facilities when African football is discussed internationally. With Morocco built to co-host the 2030 FIFA World Cup, has this tournament challenged those narratives? And if so, how?
You could say that in a way because, to be honest, this Africa Cup of Nations, this edition, we've seen a huge leap forward in all of those aspects, facilities, logistics. It has been really top notch. Fantastic effort has been put in by Morocco, especially in terms of building infrastructure and committing into making a truly elite tournament. So that has been a huge source of encouragement for Africa, and I'm sure that would assuage some of the criticisms, like you said, that have been levied against AFCON down the years. So whether or not this dispels those narratives completely is a different matter. As we know, Morocco will, like you said, Morocco will co-host 2030 World Cup, and based on what we've seen at this AFCON, they are definitely ready to do just that. But to use them, to use their situation as a representation of what to expect from the rest of Africa, I think most African nations are still quite a way back in terms of that level of investment, that level of infrastructure development, and all of that. So it's very much a contextual situation here. Morocco themselves have done have done themselves proud and have done Africa proud in that respect. But I think the rest of the tournament really needs to catch up.
Now, one of the most striking aspects of the AFCON is the presence of African-based players competing with those from European leagues. What does this say about the growth of domestic leagues on the continent?
I would say that's generally always been the case. Up until like 40 to 45 years ago, most Africa Cup of Nations were overwhelmingly populated by players who were playing on the continent. As European football opened up to African players and we started to export more and more of our stars there, it's the dynamic has sort of shifted, and now it almost seems like players who play locally are in the team. But still, the fact that every AFCON comes and we see that in certain cases, these players who are based in Africa can compete favorably with their peers who are coming in from Europe. I think that speaks volumes. Africa is growing very rapidly in terms of the level of its football, its leagues, and its organization, and we can see that brought to bear on the standard of play at the Africa Cup of Nations. We've seen South Africa do really well, mostly with a team called from their local league. We've seen the same from Egypt down the years. Egypt, of course, are record champions, have won the AFCON 7 times, and they've always been overwhelmingly populated by players from their local league. So it is a very interesting dynamic. It's one that is often the topic of conversation, and it's one from which a lot of African nations can take great deal of pride.
Now, the debate around diaspora-born players choosing which country to represent is ongoing. From your perspective, how should we understand this choice? Could it be a footballing decision, an identity decision, or something much deeper?
I think it's a mix of all of those things, but it's the human aspect of it. You mentioned identity is something that we really need to take into account. For the most part, this we've come into a generation of players that are second generation. So it's not those who left Nigeria necessarily. It's the children of that generation. So these people were born and raised outside of Africa and do not have the same emotional and social ties. So it's in a way you have to look at it and understand their decision from the point of view of this is the environment and the culture where they were born is all they've been exposed to. So in a way, asking them to come and play for Nigeria or other any other African nation really is almost you're uprooting them really. So that's something that takes a lot of consideration. It's not a decision that one just takes lightly, and I think it's something that both sides of the argument have to understand. There is the footballing aspect, which is typically the when it comes to competing for the biggest prizes in football, the European nations are obviously they have a huge advantage in that regard. They are closer to the top of the pyramid in world football. So if a player chooses to represent the country of his birth in Europe, he's probably likelier to win honors. But international football, I think, is one that has to be looked at from a more holistic lens than just where can I win the most silverware? Because even if we look at it, by any metric, international football offers far less by way of trophies anyway. So that cannot be, or that should not be, the entire basis of the decision. However, we also, like I said, need to consider that these players are human beings as well. And that facet of it is something that they have to grapple with. How does a player feel on the inside? What do they most identify themselves with in terms of their personality? And that's something that they all need to consider, and that's something that we have to understand. It's not an easy decision. It will always be difficult, no matter the circumstance.
Now, AFCON produces unforgettable moments every edition, but many of them fade without proper documentation. Now, tell us about the book you've written and how storytelling can ensure African football's greatest moments are remembered with the depth they deserve.
Yeah, so you are right in pointing out that generally in Africa there is a challenge with documenting notable historic events and moments. That's something that I set out to remedy with my book, which is titled Elusive: How Enyimba Ended Nigeria's 39-year wait for Champions League glory. Enyimba, of course, are record Nigerian champions. In 2003 and 2004, they won the CAF Champions League, the first Nigerian club to do so in history, and they repeated the feat the following year, so they retained their title. And that's a story that I felt telling and that has not been told previously. So I took it upon myself to document that, not just for myself, but for posterity's sake, because it's particularly relevant in the case of Nigeria, for example, because Nigeria has not had the same level of success since then. So a book like that is important because it opens up the minds of people. There are people who were born after that success that have no frame of reference for a successful Nigerian club on the African continent. So the same thing can apply to different nations. There are countries that have had golden periods in history, but have fallen on harder times, and they have many generations who have been born without experiencing their country being truly dominant or even active as a footballing or sporting superpower on the continent. So having this kind of information, having this kind of documentation, this kind of literature to go through, it will give them that mindset, that understanding that this is what is possible. This has happened before. It can happen again under the right circumstances, and success such as this is not beyond us. It also is very important because documenting these things helps us put the right emphasis and the right light on some of the individuals who were involved. So we've had a lot of great players who, maybe because they did not necessarily play for the national teams or did not have glittering careers, may go under the radar. So something like this is important in that respect.
Now, there's been a lot of debate around the decision by CAF to move the AFCON from a 2-year cycle to a 4-year cycle in future. Some analysts see it as a practical footballing decision, while others see it as raising questions about Africa's independence in shaping its own football calendar. How do you personally interpret this shift?
Personally speaking, I think it's a welcome shift. And I understand where the other side of the argument comes from, which is that um, it's not just enough to do something. It's also important to recognize why it has been done and who is prompting that action. So even though I've personally always felt that the AFCON should move to a 4-year cycle, and more attention should be given to club competitions, for example. It's the timing of it, as well as the perception that FIFA is behind this sudden decision to switch up the timing of the AFCON, is what has made people so resistant to the idea of this change. Also, Africa is very peculiar compared to other continents. The AFCON is a huge part of Africa's financial, of CAF's financial planning. So having the AFCON as regularly as they have done has allowed CAF to bring in a lot of revenues. How CAF is going to address the shortfall that will result from this remains to be seen. No one really understands how they intend to do it. So for someone like me who was open to the idea, I'm sort of mildly curious to see what happens. But for those who oppose the idea, that's the concept of CAF struggling financially as a result of this decision is yet another data point for them to use to argue against this, and to insist that this is not a change that was absolutely necessary. My concern is this in the long run a benefit to African football? And I think it is, even though you could look at it and say because of the route through which this decision has taken, it might not, it might signify a, like you say, a loss of independence for CAF and a bit of overreach on the part of FIFA. If FIFA have gotten to the point of dictating the timings of competitions for different confederations, then who knows what's next? Would they start to dictate executive decisions as well? So it's a little bit of overreach, and that's in principle is worrying. Even though the idea itself, I am intrigued by it, and I would like to see how CAF are able to implement it in the short and the medium and long term.
Now, finally, Solas, when this tournament ends, what lasting legacy should the AFCON 2025 leave for African football, and what should the global audience take away from it?
I think the defining legacy for this AFCON will be something we've touched on already, which is that Morocco have done a splendid job in terms of hosting. We've seen for the very first time what an AFCON can be like if all of the logistics, all of the infrastructure, all of the playing surfaces, all of that, if everything is handled properly, is done professionally, and is done to a very high standard. So I think from this, it's going to be somewhat anachronistic for any future hosts to lower the standard. So I think that's really the legacy of this AFCON, is what excellence is possible on the African continent. And also it's a challenge to future hosts. It lays down a marker. Anyone who's going to host the AFCON after this has to, at the very least, match this. And I think the more we have AFCONs where teams don't have to worry about poor pitches or poor accommodation or bad transportation infrastructure and can just focus on the football, the better the standard of the sport on the continent will be.
Thank you very much, Solas, for sharing your time and insights with us. Well, that's all we have today in African News. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned to A News.